We all have to pay taxes, and we constantly hear politicians arguing over the national debt and government borrowing. But it begs a very simple, almost childlike question. If the government is the one who makes the money, why do they need to tax us? Why do they need to borrow? Why doesn't the government just print unlimited money to pay for everything? To answer that, we have to look at a macroeconomic theory called modern monetary theory, or MMT. MMT departs from the mainstream economic consensus and points out a fundamental truth about how fiat currency works. A sovereign government that issues its own currency is a monopoly issuer. According to this theory, the government doesn't actually need your tax money to fund its operations. In fact, it has to spend currency into existence before any tax revenue can even be collected. When a government spends, it creates money. When it taxes, it effectively destroys that money, pulling it out of circulation. Because of this, a government that prints its own money can never be forced to default on debt denominated in its own currency. It can always just print more to pay what it owes. MMT synthesizes ideas from Georg Friedrich Knapp's state theory of money, which noted in 1905 that money is a creature of law. Knapp argued that the state can create pure paper money and make it exchangeable by simply recognizing it as legal tender. So, if they can print whatever they need, why not run the presses constantly? The barrier isn't a lack of paper or ink. MMT economists acknowledge that a government is limited politically in its money creation by something called demand pull inflation. This happens when the real, tangible resources of an economy like unemployed workers and capital are fully utilized at full employment. If you keep printing money after the economy has reached its full capacity, further money creation will simply generate inflation. MMT argues that inflation pressures can be mitigated by increasing taxes to reduce the spending capacity of the private sector. This physical reality is closely tied to a concept called the quantity theory of money, the oldest surviving theory in economics. As far back as 1517, the Renaissance mathematician Nicolaus Copernicus originally formulated the theory. It was later developed by prominent thinkers like John Locke and Irving Fisher. The theory states that the general price level of goods and services is directly proportional to the amount of money in circulation. The core idea rests on the equation of exchange, where money supply times velocity equals price level times real output. If the supply of money goes up drastically and real output is independent, money creation will directly raise the price level. In simpler terms, a constant growth rate in the money stock will lead to a constant inflation rate. Later, John Maynard Keynes accepted the quantity theory in principle, coining the phrase that, in the long run, we are all dead. In the 1950s, Milton Friedman used it as a cornerstone for monetarist thinking. Friedman and Anna Schwartz concluded that movements in money explained most of the fluctuations in economic output. When a government ignores this reality and runs the money printers to fund massive debts, the results are catastrophic. Hyperinflation is generally characterized by an inflation rate of greater than 50% per month. It rapidly erodes the value of a currency, which leads to economic stagnation and a total loss of confidence. Historical accounts of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s show how severe inflation wipes out savings and destabilizes society. Inflation becomes not just an economic phenomenon, but a moral one, where trust in institutions deteriorates along with the currency. To see the terrifying reality of what happens when a government tries to print its way out of debt, we look at Zimbabwe. Official statistics wouldn't even release data because numbers hit 3. Although initially stable, the underlying problems in Zimbabwe's economy began to emerge as early as the 1990s, due to a lethal combination of policy mismanagement, institutional corruption, and controversial land reform programs. In 2000, the government initiated a massive restructuring of its agricultural sector, seizing land from white farm owners and redistributing it to black farmers. However, many of the new owners lacked the necessary experience and resources to maintain the farms, which led to a devastatingly sharp decline in agricultural output and food production. As the country suddenly struggled to feed itself, food prices began to rise. At the same time, the banking sector collapsed under the weight of severe economic sanctions from the United States, EU, and IMF. Furthermore, Political looting by societal elites and government officials left the banking sector completely unable to mobilize funds for investments or basic loans. Banks simply refused to lend money because the political and monetary uncertainty made it far too risky. As a result, economic output sharply declined. Faced with massive debts and nationwide starvation, the government turned on the money printers to finance military action and import food. However, this gambit to ramp up food imports turned out to be a massive catalyst for hyperinflation, as Zimbabwe quickly found itself in even greater debt denominated in foreign currency. As the government flooded the economy with freshly printed cash, the explosion in currency caused a rapid, uncontrollable increase in prices. To make matters worse, institutional corruption severely worsened the crisis. The Zimbabwean government actively underreported its money printing activities by over $20 million every single month. Instead of addressing the collapse, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe doubled down by increasing money printing and bizarrely declaring inflation to be illegal. As prices doubled in hours, the government continuously redenominated its currency to keep up, replacing small bills with millions and billions. This culminated in the surreal injection of a $100 trillion note into circulation. By mid-November 2008, inflation had reached an astronomical 79.6 billion % month, an 89.7 sextillion % year-on-year. The national currency became virtually worthless. Hyperinflation eroded the value of the dollar and destroyed public trust in monetary policy. Citizens were forced to abandon their money entirely, resorting to bartering for basic goods just to survive. Others relied on the black market to illegally exchange for stable foreign currencies. It is clear that attempting to print unlimited money to finance government spending and pay off debts created a disaster of unprecedented scale. But what exactly is the underlying mathematical mechanism behind this? Why does adding more paper money inevitably destroy its value? To understand why simply adding more paper money into an economy inevitably destroys its value, we have to look at modern monetary theory, or MMT. MMT departs from the mainstream consensus by pointing out that a sovereign government is the monopoly issuer of its own fiat currency. According to this theory, the government does not actually need to collect your tax money to fund its operations. Instead, it creates money whenever it spends, effectively destroys money by pulling it out of circulation via taxation, because the government is the sole creator. MMT argues it can never be forced to default on debts denominated in its own money, as it can always just print more to pay what it owes. So, if the government can print whatever it needs, why not run the presses constantly? MMT economists acknowledge that money creation is strictly limited by physical reality, specifically by something called demand pull inflation. This happens when real resources like workers, capital, and natural resources are fully utilized at full employment. If a government keeps printing and spending after reaching this capacity, it isn't creating new wealth. It is just creating more money, chasing the exact same amount of goods, which simply generates inflation. This physical limit illustrates the oldest surviving theory in economics, the quantity theory of money. Originally formulated by Nicolaus Copernicus in 1517, the theory states that price level is proportional to the amount of money in circulation. In 1911, economist Irving Fisher formalized this into a simple mathematical rule called the equation of exchange. The equation is straightforward. M times V equals P times Y. M is the money supply, and V is the transaction's velocity. On the other side, P is the general price level, and Y represents the actual real output of goods and services. If the supply of money drastically increases while output is constrained, the math dictates that prices must rise to balance the equation. In Zimbabwe's case, the situation was worse because their economic capacity declined while the money supply was exploding. When a government runs the printers to fund massive deficits, prices skyrocket, triggering a terrifying psychological effect. As documented in When Money Dies, soaring inflation quickly destroys public trust in the currency and destabilizes civil society. When citizens realize their money is losing value, they panic and try to spend it as quickly as possible on tangible goods. This frantic spending drastically increases the velocity of money, that V in our equation. As money changes hands faster, it causes prices to increase at an ever-accelerating rate, creating a vicious cycle of hyperinflation. Currency effectively dies, and savings are entirely wiped out. Once this mathematical reality takes hold and a currency collapses, how does a country ever recover?